Have you ever tried to share something you care deeply about, but it's not as good as you remember? Don't get me wrong, it's still very good. The characters, the story, the message. Sublime. But there's that one thing, that black hole, an imperfection in the surface so bold, so glaring, that any first-time viewer can hardly ignore it. Maybe once, as if you had ever been a novice, you were familiar with that blemish. But now you've clearly taken it for granted. How could it not be there? That blemish, that drawback, is at the core of the thing that you care about. Tonight, we are here to talk about those imperfections. Tonight, we are here about recommending the unrecommendable. Who doesn't like werewolves? The ethos of the werewolf is someone who looks just like you and I, walking among us, but has a dark secret, an intolerable beast within just waiting to be let out. My interest in these things have left me fascinated with true crime and horror for well over a decade. I remember nights of slowly acclimating myself to the scares of supernatural or being shocked by tales of various serial killers over the course of the past century. Later, I searched for some of the best true crime media I could find, and I found it. Mindhunter was a hit Netflix original TV series that ran from 2017 to 2019, adapting the 1995 book Mindhunter inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit by John E. Douglas and Mark Olshaker. This show had it all, helmed by David Fincher, one of the best true crime directors in the last few decades, a star-studded cast, strong source material, and to top it off, some of the most compelling depictions of real-life serial killers put to screen. The show follows amateur FBI agent Holden Ford as he and his grizzled partner try to concoct psychological profiles for various serial killers in the United States. Within the series, they interview different famous killers such as Ed Kemper, David Berkowitz, and Charles Manson. Naturally, as any 14-year-old knows, staring into the abyss of humanity has it stare back into you. This remains true for a duo of FBI agents. Ford becomes engrossed in his work, learning how to play off serial killers' neuroses to extract confessions. He gets in trouble with his supervisors, his love life falls apart, and he finds himself unable to detach from the work, eventually leading to him developing a panic disorder. Meanwhile, Agent Bill Tench, played by Holt McCallany, has his home life slowly fall apart as his wife and their adopted son are disturbed by the violent nature of his work and their own implications in local murders. Psychology professor Wendy Carr, played by Anna Torv, who joins the team midway through the first season, also has a relationship with her partner fall apart. Mindhunter, to this day, remains one of the best true crime-inspired pieces of media I have ever seen. At a high production value, compelling writing, experts in true crime at its helm, and the perspective from federal law enforcement that is particularly compelling to me. It had the thrill and mystery of solving gruesome murders, compelling interpersonal drama, and a look at the office politics that can make or break entire departments. Despite the monsters at the center of the subject matter, the show never misses the human element. It is also now at this point that we need to come to the sticking point. There is no payoff. Mindhunter's 2 seasons debuted on Netflix in October of 2017 and August of 2019. But then, like many things, the 3rd season never materialized. The series was successful, sure, but it never made the profits that something of its cost demanded. Fincher himself hoped that there would be 5 seasons, but in 2020, the cast and the crew were released from their contracts to afford them the flexibility of other projects. In 2023, Fincher confirmed Mindhunter was dead. Like many killers that escape justice, Mindhunter just slipped through our fingers. I don't know when I first learned about Game of Thrones, but I can tell you about the lead up to it. Like many children in the 2000s, I was raised on the icons of our time. The Lord of the Rings movies, Harry Potter, and Percy Jackson. I've always been fascinated by the fantastical and the monstrous, drawn to worlds like our own, but operated by fundamentally different rules. It would not be until 8th grade that I became truly aware of Game of Thrones, pitched to me as the hit TV show with sex and dragons, something that I was truly too young to watch. Only secretly, at a friend's house, did my brother and I marathon the entire first season. In the following months, I tore through the rest of the series, exhausting my supply of content when the 5th season finished airing in spring of 2015. It is because of Game of Thrones that dark fantasy survives to this day. But I'm not here to talk about Game of Thrones, HBO's critically acclaimed cultural touchstone of television. I was there
5 years ago, when the strength of D&D failed.
Tonight, I am here to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire. A Song of Ice and Fire is a long-running dark fantasy series created by prolific science fiction short story writer George R. R. Martin. After writing a few chapters back in 1991, the first installment, A Game of Thrones, was published in 1996. This is not to be confused with the massively popular HBO TV series Game of Thrones, which was syndicated from 2011 to 2019. Following A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords, A Feast for Crows, and A Dance with Dragons, respectively published in 1998, 2000, 2005, and 2011. The planned penultimate novel in the heptalogy, The Winds of Winter, is, reportedly, still being written over 13 years later. One of the first selling points of A Song of Ice and Fire is a developed, interconnected world. Iconic house words, such as "Winter is coming," "Hear me roar," and "We do not sow," pull us deeper into political machinations, religious conflict, and general feudal shenaniganery of Westeros. This is not to mention the black-cloaked brothers of the Night's Watch defending the world against ice zombies, the various free cities of Essos, or greater curiosities and monsters and magic on the edges of the known world. But what is A Song of Ice and Fire really about? To answer that, we need to turn to the characters. I've always agreed with William Faulkner. He said that the human heart in conflict with itself is the only I've always agreed with William Faulkner when he said that the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. I've always taken that as my guiding principle, and the rest is just set dressing. A bastard who struggles to find the right way to rule, an infamous knight and noble who tries to become a better man, a woman who tries to be virtuous in a war-torn land. Through the eyes of these characters and dozens more, George R. R. Martin grapples with the core conflicts of the world. These themes in the story boil down to two general topics of discussion. First, Martin explores existentialist ideas of free will and morality through his characters' oaths and choices. Is it right to kill an evil king you have sworn to protect? Why do we obey some laws and not others? Do we have an obligation to do the right thing even when it's hard? Love is the death of duty after all. Second, Martin critiques patriarchal systems and state violence, the feudal structures of Westeros, which sell its daughters into sexual slavery through arranged marriages and sends its sons off to die in wars, serves as an excellent canvas to do so. Of course, these topics are then broken up into more specific themes, such as utilitarian thinking, vengeance, religious fanaticism, and gender identity. And then there's the quality of the writing itself. While the fanbase and I love lines such as "fat pink mast" or "pale sticky princess," the prose is really beautiful and it pervades the entire series. Individual characters have their own way of describing the world, their own voices, and their own levels of detail or internal monologue. Martin's bibliography has given him the expertise to craft every single chapter of A Song of Ice and Fire as his own short story, down to the punchy opening lines and closing ones. The Dornish prince was 3 days dying. The night was rank with the smell of man. The prophet was drowning men on Great Wick when they came to tell him the king was dead. But what is excellent prose and compelling characters without new content? At the time of recording, it is now late 2024 and has been over 13 years since the release of A Dance with Dragons. But why has it been so long since a release in the mainline series? George R. R. Martin has always struggled with his plans for A Song of Ice and Fire. Back in the 90s, George's original plan for A Song of Ice and Fire was a trilogy. 3 books that covered the War of the Five Kings, Daenerys' conquest of Westeros, and the invasion of the others. There was also meant to be a 5-year gap somewhere in the story, which explains why a lot of the characters are much younger than they act. At the start of the story, Jon is 14 and Daenerys is 13? Even when George was writing A Game of Thrones, the story ballooned and became clear that he would not be able to fit everything into just 3 books. 2 more were added, and when writing the 4th book, A Dance with Dragons, in the early 2000s, over 20 years ago, George not only decided to scrap the 5-year gap, but split A Dance with Dragons into 2 different books, each with half the POVs. Some fans say that more than 24 years later, we're still waiting for the sequel to the action-packed Storm of Swords. But not forever. YouTuber and theory crafter extraordinaire Preston Jacobs has created a project called Sweet Robin's The Winds of Winter fanfiction. Preston, who is the closest thing to a George R. R. Martin completionist there is, works with a suite of editors to compile official preview chapters, notes on preview chapters read at cons, and fan theories to fabricate chapters for The Winds of Winter in a close facsimile of George's writing style as possible. It is one of the best things to come out of the fandom in years. Oh, and I haven't even mentioned my issues with the subject matter yet. As is well known, A Song of Ice and Fire is replete with violence, sexual violence, and sex. While these subjects are used to reinforce the themes of the story, criticism of the patriarchy and sanctioned violence against women, it means the topics are necessarily brought up in the work. Sansa needs to hide the fact that she is menstruating to avoid an arranged marriage, and Randall Tarley thinks the knightly Brienne could benefit from a good thing. Catelyn Stark thinks that her 14-year-old son Robb is too young to lead, but Daenerys is old enough to be married off to a Dothraki warlord at 13. Side note, I fucking hate reading about how the 13-year-old Daenerys learns to love her pedophilic abuser and carries his child. On top of that, I fucking hate even more that this Daenerys plotline is required reading for the rest of the series. I want to recommend people read the books, but I have to sit through this bullshit. Besides for, and partially because of its flaws, A Song of Ice and Fire is one of my favorite things. Period. It is the benchmark by which I measure all other fantasy series. Does it have great characters, a compelling plot, lore intrigue, something important to say, and is it fun to read? A strong yes to all of these. It and the fan community are the reasons why I try to critically engage with art, to really get back to the medium and figure out what the author is trying to say and how good of a job they do it. A Song of Ice and Fire taught me that the author, their text, and I deserve that respect. And as for lesser media which can't compete, well, it just can't. Do I recommend A Song of Ice and Fire? Yes. Should you read all of the books? No. For you, my recommended viewing order is watching seasons 1 through 4 of the show, and then reading books 3 through 5. While this means repeating content in A Storm of Swords, Storm is good enough to warrant it. Valerie reviewed this. Berserk is one of those things that has wormed its way so thoroughly into the zeitgeist that you're almost certainly familiar with Berserk, Berserk's concepts, or something inspired by Berserk. Have you seen the symbol? For my life, I couldn't tell you when I first became aware of Berserk, but I could tell you about when I first engaged with it. It was back in high school, watching YouTube on my phone before bed. I came across a review for Berserk and was prompted to watch the whole 1997 series. What must have been no less than a month later, I rushed into my brother's room on some Saturday afternoon to show him clips of the eclipse while he's saying, Look, you don't understand, but it's so bad. It's so bad. By the time the credits rolled on the last episode, I knew that part of me would never be the same. But what is Berserk? Originally pitched in 1998 by a young mangaka named Kentaro Miura, Berserk is a long-running dark fantasy action manga whose influence has permeated into much of popular culture. Nearly every edgy guy with a big sword is an homage to the main character, Guts. And the iconography has influenced everything from Elden Ring to the Avengers. Berserk's story follows Guts, a powerful mercenary in the Band of the Hawk led by Griffith, an ethereally beautiful and charismatic man. The first part of the story follows Guts' life and the rise of the Band of the Hawk, in the consequences of the character's actions. The story pivots more into a dark fantasy story about demons and magic. Berserk's overarching story deals with themes of causality, destiny, and finding one's purpose in life. But the series is so long-running that individual arcs have covered topics such as the cycle of violence, ambition, letting go, and recovering from trauma. This is also not to mention that the art of Berserk is good. Like, really, really good. Mura was talented not only in figure drawings, but also landscapes, panelistry, paging, action, and architecture. The man did it all! While anybody can find ways to read Berserk.com, nothing comes close to experiencing the manga firsthand in one of the leather-bound deluxe editions. This is why I support the official release. Berserk is the product of a lifetime of work by a truly talented individual. Oftentimes when I read or watch things, I compare them to Berserk. The art may be good, but is it as good as Berserk? This show has something compelling to say about personal growth and the struggle against an uncaring world. But Berserk did it better. It's these heights that make Berserk's flaws all the more glaring. Berserk is rightfully pitched as a gritty dark fantasy manga. It comes with a healthy amount of edge. Visceral disembowelment and nudity are the name of the game, but especially in the earlier parts of the manga, sexual assault is commonplace. While abusers almost universally get their comeuppance immediately after violating others, save for that one time for plot reasons. Side note, I hate the Lost Children arc. I know it's meant to show how bad the world of Berserk is for children, and I know it's meant to show Berserk at his lowest, his most ferocious, the most, Berserk. But, how am I supposed to tell a new reader that there's this arc, which is full of violence, sexual violence, and violence against children, some of which is not to mention Rosine's entire character design. But if you have a hard time with these topics, this does not necessarily mean that Berserk is not for you. There is nothing wrong with starting the story midway through the Hog of the Millennium Empire arc, after which certain topics are less common. If sexual assault is a no-go for you, but you're still interested, I'd recommend starting at chapter 196 and skipping chapters 204 and about 216 to 221. And of course, there is nothing wrong with getting a friend to screen the chapters for you either. Despite lasting over 350 chapters and running across several decades, Berserk remains unfinished to this day. In the latter 2 decades of its production, chapters would only come out every couple of months and at irregular intervals. One of the longer hiatuses lasted from December 2012 to April 2014. Many fans would wish for the hiatuses to end, and this was cruelly granted. In the spring of 2021, we lost Kentaro Miura. Berserk's unfinished 364th chapter was released posthumously with one hell of a cliffhanger. Today Berserk still has hiatuses, but is continued on by Miura's proteges and his lifetime friend and fellow mangaka Koji Mori. Berserk feels like one of those things that you need to engage with simply because it's the pinnacle of its kind. Despite having read manga for years, I didn't truly appreciate the medium until I read Berserk. I have always loved fantasy, but I didn't truly understand what types of stories could be told until I read Berserk. The setting and characters seamlessly pull from history and folklore to make a wholly original story that resonates across cultures and time. In the words of my brother, Berserk is one of those few stories where I truly marvel at the fact that someone was able to bring it into this world. Berserk feels like one of those things that you're hesitant to bring up in conversation, but once you do, people come out of the woodwork to admit that they've read it too. Sort of like when you bring up topics like Gene Seed or Exterminatus. Don't worry, that video is coming too. In short, Berserk commands a strong response from anyone who's engaged with it, to any significant extent. It made a great impact on me, but it's been nothing short of life-changing for others. As anyone who has outpaced their favorite book series or TV show knows, there is a distinct difference between being caught up with a TV series and a series being permanently unfinished. In a world of live service products and uncertain futures, finality can be a luxury. Regrettably, there will be no more seasons in Mindhunter, and because of the turning of the world, we will almost certainly not get a Winds of Winter, and Preston Jacobs might not even be able to finish the fanfic. I, like many others, might not live to see the end of Berserk. All three of these series mentioned today are near pinnacles of their kind. While they all have significant drawbacks and are inherently unfinished, they are certainly worth the investment. While for Berserk and A Song of Ice and Fire, there seems to be no upper limit on the devotion that a fan can show. But in moments of uncertainty, facing dark times ahead, devotion is what keeps us going. The inherent struggle in life, the fight against evil men, the binding power of oaths, these series teach us much and more. Now, I'm not going to quote Berserk or A Song of Ice and Fire at you and pretend I'm being deep, but even if you force back what was lost, it still won't be the way it was. The only time when we can be brave is when we're afraid. Thank you for watching. Yeah, so welcome to the post video. This one was meant to be something like a palate cleanser after my most recent video, the Botched Assassinations one, and how that took me like 3 months to do. In that time I moved and other things happened. This video is being recorded in mid-November 2024, so that's what's going on. But I hope everyone's doing well, and there are definitely more videos coming out in the future. Until then, stay safe and live well.